And most importantly, of course, I've learned from it. I now know what moose milk is, which is not something you learn in the U.S. Navy. In looking today at in the right direction, looking today at U.S. carriers and following my distinguished fellow panelist here, as a person who ashore was a strategist, I want to start out looking at what the strategic rationale is. And I think we've had various perspectives on that from our previous folks, but let me give you a U.S. perspective. And then I want to take on a little more directly some of the criticisms. Let's just tee them up and before the discussion for talking about, and I'll give you my perspective on it. And then I'll go through and talk about where we stand right today in terms of our carrier programs and what the prospects are, and draw the appropriate conclusions from that. I think First Sea Lord really said it best. Just this, ironically, 4th of July, he noted that countries that aspire to strategic international influence have aircraft carriers. It is a great deal of what we're talking about is about the ability to influence on the international scene. And we'll look at some of the more specific aspects of that. From a U.S. perspective, we do not subscribe to the Godfather strategy of keep your friends close and your enemies closer. We like to keep our enemies on the other side of the oceans in a strategic sense. So if you're going to operate forward globally, and for all the things that we do in that, most importantly, to dissuade and deter, our maritime strategy says that preventing war is as important as winning it. So that tool called the aircraft carrier is absolutely critical in a strategic sense from that. And it gives you the ability not only for peacetime influence, deterrence, and dissuasion, but right up the scale of conflict to full combat readiness. And of course, the essence of that in the modern carrier is projection of air power, sea-based air power. We're an as needed, and it's not strictly Navy, it's for joint operations. It covers our allies and partners as well, particularly when they lack the sea-based air. So it fulfills all of those things. Most notably are two characteristics I would have. First is mission flexibility. We have used carriers in many different ways over the years. You know, you can go back to the early days of the carrier aviation, well before World War II, when they were originally just sort of long-range scouting for the fleet. And then, of course, coming of age, tactical air power from the sea in World War II, but also convoy air defense, the jeeps and the escort carriers, the smaller carriers. After World War II, the great debate with the Air Force, interesting comments from my friend Overhaul there about the Navy Air Force strategic jockey, not limited to India by any means. And indeed, in our case, it led to the so-called revolt of the admirals in 1949-50 time frame. And that was over whether to build a so-called super carrier, a large carrier, carry heavy aircraft that could carry nuclear weapons in this new nuclear age. And eventually the Navy did that, and now we don't anymore. And now we're back to where it's been before: tactical air power, support for operations ashore, what we experienced, what I personally experienced in Vietnam context, and all of you have experienced in subsequent contingencies. But it's also been used as a helicopter carrier, like the Royal Navy used for Apaches. In Haiti, they actually loaded a whole brigade off and took them down. It has proved very useful in the tsunami, Boxing Day tsunami, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And most recently with our Japanese allies just last year. And of course, it's a great command and control and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platform. So what you've got there is a platform, a large platform that's very adaptable. We've seen the evolution of the missions. I won't go into the details here, but the composition of the air wing, which is very important, has also changed over time to reflect the changes in the mission profiles. Okay, let's talk a little about the two most common criticisms of carriers. The first one is that they are vulnerable. And this is not a new criticism. If you go into on the internet and look up the Navy Day 1945, barely a month after the end of World War II, the height of carrier power. The U.S. had over 100 carriers, counting the small ones. Time magazine, even then, is speculating that, well, you know, maybe carriers, maybe surface ships, maybe that's not going to be the way. So this is not a new criticism. This is 70 years ago. And then the question arises, compared to what are they vulnerable? This is a platform that can move at 35 knots. I don't know many air bases ashore that can move at that speed. And people speak of precision, targeting, DF-21 ballistic missiles and all the stuff, which, by the way, the Soviets tried and had much more elaborate before. It ain't that easy, especially when it's moving. So I think you have to ask vulnerable compared to what? If you want to say an all-out war, okay, but you know, that's something where everything is vulnerable. And really, you need to look at the few empirical cases we have that indicate how vulnerable it is. Most notably, the 1967 fire, which actually started when a young Lieutenant Commander John McCain's aircraft had a Zuni rocket fired into it on the deck. On the carrier forestall, they had 9,000-pound bombs blow up on the flight deck. And that carrier was able to sail on, go in, get damage repaired, and be out within a few months. So that's fairly conclusive that you know, it's not that easy to put down. Now let's talk the second problem: cost. Yes, carriers are expensive. If you want to know how expensive, the last George H.W. Bush, the last CVN-77 is our last of our 10 NIMITZ class carriers, commissioned a couple of years ago. It came in at about $6 billion, very mature design at that point. The first three, which had been authorized about 6 years ago, of the new CVN-78 Gerald R. Ford class carriers, will come in at about $12 billion each on average. I think the first one's probably going to be about 13.8, but it has a lot of new items on it and other things. Now, that's a big ticket item. It's almost a third of what we spend on plastic surgery, cosmetic surgery in the U.S. every year. So that's a big ticket item. But you know, that's spread over many years. You usually have 3 or 4 years advanced procurement funding. For example, 47% of the funding, direct funding, for items for the CVN-79, the second Ford class carrier, was already spent by the beginning of our new fiscal year yesterday. So that funding is spread out over a number of years. It used to be 4 years of actual procurement funding, and it was increased to 5 last year in the new Defense Authorization Act was finally passed to approve spreading it over 6 years. So, and of course, you know, extending construction times cost you some money too, and some inflation in the process. But my point is that sticker shock is not all in 1 year. Okay, it's like getting a sticker shock with a house. You don't pay it all in 1 year. You pay the mortgage over time, which is not the way we fund most of our other ships, by the way. They have to be paid that year. The other thing about the cost is that you're talking about a carrier lifespan of over a half century, and you're talking about a platform that's adaptable over time. Okay, so let's look at what we've got there. Speaking of over half century, USS Enterprise, last survivor and flagship of the Atlantic Fleet during the Cuban Missile Crisis a half century ago this month, will come back. She's now in the Gulf and the Arabian Sea. Will come back from her last deployment there and begin decommissioning, deactivation in the last month of this year, after almost 52 years of service. So then we've got the 10 NIMITZ class carriers, each of which received a refueling complex overhaul, which we'll look at in a minute what that entails. That's a RCOH is what it means. And they're, of course, going to be in service for many years yet. And then you've got the first two carriers of the Ford class, the Gerald R. Ford, 78 and 79, John F. Kennedy, which are under construction. Both of them are very early stages on the Kennedy. A lot of the equipment's been involved. So that's what the profile looks like. Secretary of Defense Gates in the cut a couple of years ago moved the period between carrier procurement from 4 years to 5 years, which still keeps the congressionally mandated requirement of 11 carriers, except for a year and a half here when Enterprise decommissions before Ford's ready. And that's currently what the plans are. As I say, the first three were authorized in fiscal year 2008, Congressional Act. The first three of the Ford class, two of which are well into construction. One was funded, procurement year funded, so-called year, as I said, spread out in 2008. The other one will be funded this year and next, and 2018 is CBN 80, the third one. Okay, so I mentioned the long life of carriers and how they can be transformed into other uses. Interestingly enough, the whole NIMITZ class that you just saw is less than halfway through its service life. Okay, it's still got well over half of the service life of those 10 NIMITZ class carriers. So again, what you bought is going to serve for many years yet. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, without going into too much details in view of the time, is the evolution of the air wing on the carriers. You know, we've gone, even after another thing that came up in the 50s, of course, is we had some specialized ASW aircraft carriers, and then they combined the ASW and the strike carriers and into the platforms that we know today as the CVNs. But the air wing today, you can see, is F/A-18 heavy. We'll add to that the F-35, Joint Strike Fighter. We're getting the new Growler, 18G electronic warfare, completely new electronically scanned E-2D Hawkeyes, and the MH-60s. Most importantly, of course, is that you're going to have an unmanned capability. This is still under development. The first trials of its predecessor begin next year at sea. But I think by the time the early part of the next decade, you will see progressively greater amounts of the carrier air wings composed of unmanned capabilities. Okay, I mentioned the refueling complex overhaul. At the midpoint of these ships' lives, about 25 years in, they need to go into the shipyard for 2.5, 3 years and get a complete overhaul of 3 major areas. The nuclear plant needs to be refueled, the non-nuclear maintenance and heavy maintenance and structural repairs, and other modernizations in the combat systems warfighting interoperability area. And that's a standard we've been through. We're now in the 4th one of the 10 NIMITZ class, and I think it's the 3rd or 4th. And I think it's Carl Benson that's in there now getting modernized. But, you can see that on the earlier schedule I had. Okay, let's talk a little about what's different with the new carriers. Because you look at them and you say, boy, that looks like a NIMITZ class hull. And it is. The whole form is pretty much NIMITZ class, especially the last couple of NIMITZ class modifications. However, everything else is new, including if you go inside the way the berthing's laid out. There's a big fight in the number of newspaper articles that there are no more urinals. It's being built from the wheel up for designed for women, which of course the other carriers weren't way back when they were designed. But after the traditionalists get over that, there are a lot of other improvements in the messing and berthing and living areas for our sailors, which are important. A little history. I don't have to tell anybody here in Canada that getting from the idea, the concept, to actually cutting steel and building and launching and training and integrating a ship is a long-term process. The Ford class is really 16 years into that process right now and still 3 years away from 2015 delivery of the first Ford class carrier to the Navy. And you can follow this here. There was a couple of big changes, though, that were noteworthy. They were going to incrementally put a number of things: new radar, electromagnetic launching system, replace the old steam catapults, dual band radar. They were going to do those incrementally. The decision was made in 2002 to do that in one step with the first Ford class, which has helped to decrease the cost, but also gives you ships, a standard ship design for the class. Again, as I mentioned, they delayed the carriers 1 year to lengthen the cycle. The authorization, as I mentioned, was about 5 years ago now authorized funding for the first 3 ships, and the contract has been awarded now 4 years for the building. What you end up with, of course, these are the reasons that we went from the NIMITZ class, keeping the hull but changing everything else. 3 times the electric plant capacity, an open architecture, space and weight, which are filled up essentially over the life of the NIMITZ class, for integrating future air platforms. Sortie generation, this is very important, increased by 25%. We went out to NASCAR, looked at race car hits and how they get the cars back on the road quickly. And we incorporated some of that into the design of the turnaround times. But most importantly, we put new elevators, more direct type of systems and other things in there. Of course, there are a lot of things you don't see that we know is the most critical thing when you're at sea. Survivability improvements, damage control improvements, improved self-defense, increased magazine and gas storage, all of those type of things. And most importantly, since manpower is our most expensive product, is the reduction in billets. Roughly 1,000 less, actually more than that counting the air wing. About 800 on the ship, about 500 on the air wing. Less people. So instead of over 5,000, you're talking 4,000. That's still a lot of people, but over time, that life cycle cost of that is significant. In fact, life cycle cost for 50 years for the carrier, everything included, personnel and everything, is about $32 billion, and the new one will be about $27 billion. So you've got $5 or $6 billion savings over the lifetime of this class ship, and that was some of what went into it. Other things, just real quickly now, to change the catapults, going to this electromagnetic catapult, which appears to be working. There have been over 32,000 shore-based launchings. The sea base will start next year, some trials. But this is, there were a lot of nervousness about that because we would have had the largest helicopter carrier in the world if it didn't work. But it appears to be going. The new advanced arresting gear that has to go with that, which enables you to quickly set the weight and all on the traps, which is a big problem and a necessity. I mentioned the weapons elevators and the movement being modernized. New reactors, new nuclear reactors, new design, more minimum manning. That's a big one. The other big one is a whole host of radars we're replaced by a single phased array multifunction volume search radar. And then finally, some other changes in the basic manning and certainly in the layout of the habitability and the messes and things. So what you end up with looks like this. First of all, you're going to notice the island position further aft and smaller because it doesn't have to carry all those radars. The footprint of the flight deck is you've got a bigger flight deck. Still 4.5 acres of sovereign territory. Doesn't need a visa to go anywhere, but it's going to have more space on it for aircraft and less on the fueling pits and things. There she is. As of 28 days ago, and she should launch in about 1 year from now. Actually put her in the water. And she'll be 60% complete at that point. The second ship of the class, they will have 75% complete at that point. So, what do you end up with? I think there's still a compelling rationale from a U.S. perspective that wants to keep our enemies distant and have influence to do so and deterrence to do so. I still think there's a compelling rationale as long as you have a need to strategy to operate forward globally and as long as you need that full spectrum capability, which includes sea-based air power. I think in the Asia-Pacific context, my sensei and mentor, Dr. Boutillier, has done so much to educate me on. Of course, the vast tyranny of distance out here in the Asia-Pacific, it's even more vital to have that capability. And then cost is always going to be challenged. And vulnerability, I think we tend to exaggerate that a little bit sometimes, or take it out of context. But we can debate that in the Q&A. Thank you for your attention.